only Jimmy Hoffa can rejoice at his continued good luck. Honest union members and the general public can only regard it as a tragedy.
Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just a man. He was a storm in human form, revolutionizing unions, bending the mafia to his will, and waging war against the Kennedys in battles that shaped history. Then, one July afternoon, he drove to a suburban steakhouse and vanished, leaving behind a maroon Mercury with fishy bloodstains, a trail of betrayal, and whispers of a conspiracy so vast it brushes against presidents, assassinations, and the dark heart of America's underworld. This isn't just the story of a disappearance. It's the ultimate collision of power, greed, and loyalty. Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just tough. He was the kind of tough that could make concrete flinch. And smart? Well, not in the bookish sense. By the time he landed in prison at 55, the only book he'd ever read was The Enemy Within by Robert F. Kennedy. Ironically, it was about him. RFK painted Hoffa as a mobbed-up supervillain whose Teamsters union, Jimmy's pride and joy, was less about workers' rights and more about organized crime profits. Apparently, Kennedy had the gall to suggest Hoffa and his gangster buddies made millions from union members' sweat and blood. Jimmy wasn't exactly a fan of his book club experience and decided not to bother with a sequel. Hoffa's education ended in the 8th grade when he took a grueling stockboy job for $12 a week. By his own account, it was a happy time, presumably because he had no idea how miserable happy could get. Fast forward a few decades, and Hoffa was working even harder as the head of the Teamsters, clocking 16-hour days and stashing away a cool $12 million 1960s dollars for his troubles. Let's just say inflation's got nothing on Hoffa's hustle. Jimmy didn't need spreadsheets or sticky notes. He kept every contract and deal detail in his head, a mental filing cabinet no auditor could break into. When one of his 1.6 million union members called, Hoffa remembered their name, Union Local, and their gripe like he was running customer service for the mob. He could hold his own against Harvard economists, and when RFK came swinging with legal charges, even schooled his high-priced lawyers. Hoffa once showed up to court with 14 of them, barking instructions loud enough for the judge to wonder if he was running the trial himself. Somehow, between all this, Hoffa was also a doting husband and father. His wife, Josephine, enjoyed 40 years of his loyalty, if you overlooked his occasional womanizing. His son, James, got a Michigan State scholarship but wasn't allowed to play football because Dad said no concussions on his watch. Daughter Barbara Jo? She had a wedding so grand, it would have made Don Corleone cry. Rumor has it, though, the guest list leaned more Goodfellas than good housekeeping. One such guest might have been Chucky O'Brien, Hoffa's unofficial foster son, whose mother, Sylvia Pagano, was a mafia-adjacent femme fatale from Jimmy's early years. Sylvia and Josephine became very close friends, close enough to spark whispers of a ménage à trois. Chucky grew up as Jimmy's spitting image, both in looks and a short fuse, which Hoffa channeled into union work. Whether Chucky was Hoffa's biological son or just another Teamsters recruit is still anyone's guess, but Hoffa treated him like blood. Hoffa's career as the most powerful union leader in America hit a snag when RFK, his personal nemesis, launched a decade-long vendetta. By the time Jimmy was finally sent to prison in 1967, he'd dodged more legal traps than a cartoon coyote, besting grand juries and federal trials like it was sport. Still, he eventually landed in Lewisburg Federal Prison, but not before making Bobby Kennedy's life a bureaucratic nightmare. Jimmy's Achilles heel, however, was his questionable taste in friends. On July 30th, 1975, Hoffa drove off to meet a couple of those friends and never came back. Whether he ended up in a swamp, a trash compactor, or under Giant Stadium remains a true crime trivia question for the ages. In death, as in life, Hoffa kept everyone guessing. His ties to the mafia were as notorious as his disdain for Bobby Kennedy, whom he dismissed as a spoiled brat on polite days and far less family-friendly terms otherwise. Hoffa was convinced the Kennedys' campaign against him was a stepping stone to the White House. Ironically, Hoffa's persecution helped launch JFK's political career, and some conspiracy theorists even whisper Hoffa's name in connection with Kennedy's assassination, though evidence is thinner than a mob informant's alibi. Born James Riddle Hoffa on Valentine's Day 1913 in Brazil, Indiana, Jimmy grew up tough. After his father's death, his mother juggled 3 jobs to keep the family afloat. Young Jimmy, ever pragmatic, figured people would always need food and joined Kroger's warehouse crew during the Great Depression. The miserable working conditions inspired his first strike, a successful sit-in over strawberry crates that kick-started his career as a union organizer at 17. Unionizing in 1930s Detroit wasn't for the faint of heart or skull. Employers hired strikebreakers and mob goons to crack heads, but Hoffa wasn't one to play victim. He countered with his own muscle, often drawing on the notorious Purple Gang to even the odds. One story claims the Mafia nearly executed Hoffa before deciding he was more valuable alive, proving Jimmy could even out-negotiate death itself. Hoffa wasn't just a labor leader, he was a paradox. He fought for workers but also cut deals with gangsters. He was both a family man and a womanizer. He could negotiate contracts with professors one moment and slug it out with strikebreakers the next. Love him or loathe him, Jimmy Hoffa was an enigma wrapped in a mystery, buried, well, somewhere. If Jimmy Hoffa's rise were a screenplay, it'd be dismissed as too on the nose. The femme fatale, Sylvia Pagano, leads him to her mobster lover Frank Coppola, who introduces Hoffa to Santa Perrone, a strikebreaker whose stare alone could shatter mirrors. Perrone and his boss, Angelo Meli, cut deals with Hoffa, giving the fledgling union man a crash course in mafia economics. By his early 20s, Hoffa was Detroit's top Teamster. When he ran for a leadership position, his peers gave him a measly 4 votes out of 20, but he took the job anyway, backed by his loyal band of enforcers. Hoffa's first official role as business agent for Local 299 came with an unwritten job description: anything goes. In 1936, he met Josephine Posiwak on a picket line. She made 17 cents an hour at a laundry, and Hoffa was smitten. They married that fall, though Hoffa's new family life didn't stop him from working with Farrell Dobbs, a Trotskyite organizer, who showed him how to leapfrog towns into unionization. Hoffa perfected the strategy, weaponizing the Teamsters' control over deliveries to break strikes, crush competitors, and sell his services to mobsters who needed labor consultants. The Teamsters' influence became Hoffa's currency, as the union helped enforce mafia control of jukeboxes, cigarette machines, and anything else the mob wanted to monopolize. Hoffa's power swelled. By 27, he controlled Teamster locals across the Midwest, negotiating contracts across 23 states. When Dobbs and his communist faction were ousted from the Union in 1941, Hoffa seized complete control of the region and devised a new weapon: regional contracts, consolidating his authority and creating a direct line of power between himself and employers. Hoffa's rise wasn't without blood. Union organizing in 1930s Detroit meant brawls with police and strikebreakers. Early on, Hoffa's head was split open so often it probably needed its own medical plan. When hired thugs showed up, Hoffa fought fire with fire, employing gangsters like Detroit's Purple Gang to match blows. Over time, this partnership evolved into a symbiosis. The Mafia offered protection and muscle. Hoffa offered access to union dues, pension funds, and labor influence. As Hoffa expanded east, he stacked the deck. To take control of New York, he partnered with mobsters Johnny Dio and Tony Ducks Corallo to create 7 paper locals, phantom unions with no real members but enough votes to secure Hoffa's candidates in elections. Dio and Corallo's methods included extortion and, in Dio's case, acid attacks on critics. Hoffa admired the efficiency. In New Jersey, Hoffa found an ally in Tony Pro Provenzano, who turned Local 560 into a mafia-run fiefdom. The Provenzanos ran numbers, loan-sharking operations, and even union clerical jobs out of the same office, where Hoffa's clout guaranteed control. Meanwhile, Hoffa's power drew the attention of a young Senate lawyer named Robert Kennedy, who stumbled onto Johnny Dio's activities during an investigation in 1956. Kennedy and Hoffa met like oil and fire. Kennedy crashed a meeting at Local 299 in Detroit, only to be thrown out by Hoffa himself. Undeterred, Kennedy returned with subpoenas, sparking a decade-long feud. Hoffa mocked Kennedy at every turn, once arm-wrestling him at a Washington dinner and later shoving him against a restaurant wall during a chance encounter. The McClellan hearings made their rivalry a national spectacle. Kennedy grilled Hoffa on television, hoping to expose his mob ties. Hoffa deflected by forgetting anything incriminating, while suggesting the committee question others, who promptly took the fifth. Hoffa's ability to dodge legal traps infuriated Kennedy, who vowed to jail him. The Teamsters pension fund became Hoffa's masterpiece and the mob's jackpot. By the 1950s, Hoffa had turned the fund into a private bank for organized crime. While most pension funds relied on professional managers, Hoffa's board included convicted felons and mob-friendly employers. Loans went to mafia projects like Vegas casinos, with Hoffa pocketing kickbacks. Hoffa's financial schemes reached absurd heights. In one case, he sunk union money into a worthless Florida real estate venture, marketing swamp lots to Teamsters as prime retirement property. In another, he funneled payments from a trucking company through a business in his wife's name. Despite mounting evidence of corruption, Hoffa ascended to the presidency of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1957. He rigged the election by stacking the Credentials Committee with allies and seating hundreds of phantom delegates. By the time he took the helm, the Teamsters were effectively a mafia subsidiary, with union dues funding mob ventures and Hoffa's own ambitions. The pension fund grew exponentially under Hoffa's reign, reaching $325 million by the time he went to prison in 1967. It was the mob's golden goose, bankrolling everything from casinos to real estate. Yet while Hoffa enriched the mafia, he tightened restrictions on union pensions, making it nearly impossible for workers to collect benefits. Hoffa's control of Vegas investments fueled speculation that his knowledge of mob ownership made him a liability. By the time he disappeared in 1975, Hoffa's connections to the mafia, labor corruption, and even alleged ties to the Kennedy assassination had left him surrounded by enemies. Whether buried under a football stadium or incinerated, Hoffa's legacy is one of ruthless ambition, relentless control, and deals that made devils look honest by comparison. During the Cuban Revolution, Hoffa aligned with his mob connections to make a quick buck off the chaos, funding arms deals that supplied both sides of the conflict. When Castro emerged victorious in 1959, the mafia faced a disaster. Their Cuban gambling, narcotics, and prostitution rackets, worth millions, crumbled overnight. Hoffa, ever the opportunist, tried to salvage the situation by using Teamster funds to finance a fleet of C-74 airplanes for Castro's new regime, hedging his bets to curry favor. At the same time, the mob was plotting Castro's assassination. The mafia wasn't working alone. By 1960, the CIA enlisted mobsters in their anti-Castro schemes, using intermediaries to propose the unholy alliance. One theory suggests Hoffa served as the initial point of contact, introducing the CIA to Russell Bufalino, a mob boss with deep Teamster ties who had suffered major losses in Cuba. While Hoffa's role remains murky, the mob CIA assassination plots became a lethal web, one that claimed lives like mobster Sam Giancana, who was shot dead days before he was set to testify before Congress, and John Roselli, who was later found dismembered in an oil drum. Hoffa himself vanished just days after Giancana's death in 1975. As the hits piled up, rumors swirled about a cover-up of the CIA mafia connections. Some even tied Hoffa to President Kennedy's assassination. Hoffa reportedly despised the Kennedys with an intensity that bordered on the unhinged, referring to Bobby as the little shit. The feeling was mutual. Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, launched the infamous Get Hoffa Squad, deploying 150 federal agents to dig up enough dirt to convict the Union boss. The feud between Hoffa and the Kennedys wasn't limited to courtroom battles. Hoffa allegedly hired wiretapping expert Bernard Spindle to record Bobby and JFK's rumored escapades with Marilyn Monroe, possibly for blackmail. When Hollywood began adapting Bobby's book The Enemy Within into a film, the project was torpedoed by anonymous threats, including warnings that Teamsters wouldn't deliver the movie reels. Hoffa's animosity toward the Kennedys reached a sinister crescendo after JFK's assassination in 1963. Though he publicly claimed to mourn, Hoffa reportedly erupted when Teamster headquarters lowered its flag to half-mast, screaming, "Hoffa doesn't lower flags for hypocrites." He was even quoted as celebrating the loss of power Bobby suffered after his brother's death. Whether Hoffa played a direct role in JFK's assassination remains speculative, but his mob allies, including Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, openly discussed plans to kill the president. Hoffa's legal troubles culminated in 1967, when he entered federal prison on charges of jury tampering and defrauding the Teamsters pension fund. He was incarcerated alongside Tony Pro Provenzano, a mobster and former Hoffa ally, whose relationship with Hoffa soured after heated prison arguments.
Provenzano and Hoffa quarreled when the two men were in the same jail. Provenzano is one of the men Hoffa was supposed to meet for lunch the day he vanished.
In one infamous clash, Hoffa allegedly blamed Tony Pro and his mob associates for his incarceration, vowing to cut ties once released. Tony Pro reportedly warned Hoffa that he'd end up like Castellito, referencing a Union rival he'd murdered. Despite the animosity, Hoffa harbored dreams of reclaiming his power. Upon his release in 1971, thanks to a Nixon pardon reportedly secured by mob money, Hoffa immediately sought to overturn restrictions barring him from Union activity. This infuriated Frank Fitzsimmons, the man Hoffa had left as a figurehead during his imprisonment. Fitzsimmons, once Hoffa's loyal lieutenant, had grown fond of his new position and formed alliances with the mob, who preferred Fitzsimmons's pliability to Hoffa's strong-arm tactics. Hoffa's attempts to regain control of the Union set off a violent power struggle. Fitzsimmons's ally, Roland McMaster, a towering enforcer with a glass eye and a talent for intimidation, waged a campaign of beatings and bombings against Hoffa loyalists. Hoffa, meanwhile, allied with a curious coalition of old-school Teamsters and reformers, who viewed him as a potential agent for cleaning up the Union. Ironic, given Hoffa's history of mob entanglements. Hoffa's final mistake may have been his insistence on returning to power. On the day he disappeared, he believed he was meeting Tony Pro to reconcile their differences. Instead, Hoffa vanished without a trace. Some speculate the meeting was a setup by Provenzano and his mob associates, who viewed Hoffa as a liability. The morning of July the 30th, 1975, began uneventfully enough for Jimmy Hoffa. At his lakeside summer home, he repaired his grandchildren's toys, fielded calls about union matters, and spoke casually with his wife, Jo. But Jo noticed something unusual. Jimmy seemed uncharacteristically nervous. Still, when he mentioned a meeting with Tony Jack and a couple of other guys at the Machus Red Fox restaurant, it didn't raise alarm bells. Tony Giacalone, after all, was practically family. Their children had grown up together, and he had visited the Hoffa home just the week before. Jimmy left around noon and stopped by the office of an airport limo company he partially owned. He chatted with employees there, mentioning his plans to meet Tony J, Tony P, and another man. Tony P, of course, was Tony Provenzano. By 2:30 p.m., Hoffa was frustrated enough by his companion's tardiness to call Joe and complain that no one had shown up. It would be the last time anyone heard his voice. The next morning, Hoffa's unlocked car was discovered abandoned in the Red Fox parking lot, sparking a frenzy that rivaled the days of the Get Hoffa squad. The FBI descended, combing through credit card receipts, reservation lists, and even kitchen records to reconstruct the timeline. Witnesses placed Hoffa at the restaurant between 2 and 2:50 p.m. One claimed to have seen him arguing with the driver of a maroon Lincoln or Mercury as it left the parking lot. The driver resembled Chucky O'Brien, Hoffa's foster son. Chucky had indeed borrowed a maroon Mercury that day, an old car belonging to Tony Giacaloni's son. He explained the unusual loan by claiming he needed a vehicle to deliver a massive salmon to a union vice president. However, forensic evidence complicated his story. FBI dogs detected Hoffa's scent in the back seat and trunk of the car, and microscopic traces of hair, blood, and skin were later identified as likely Hoffa's. Chucky, who was supposed to be in Toronto that day, offered shifting alibis that left investigators skeptical. The two Tonys, Giacaloni and Provenzano, denied arranging any meeting with Hoffa. Both produced airtight alibis. Giacaloni's whereabouts were meticulously documented at the Southfield Athletic Club, with witnesses recalling every detail down to his haircut. Provenzano, meanwhile, claimed he spent the day playing Greek rummy at his New Jersey Union Hall with a trio of men, including Salvatore Sally Bugs Braguglio, a wiry business agent known for his ability to commit murder and still enjoy lunch. Sally Bugs became a key figure in the investigation. Witnesses placed a man matching his description in a brown or maroon car at the Red Fox parking lot shortly before Hoffa's disappearance. A lineup later confirmed his presence, but Sally Bugs took the fifth when questioned. Provenzano, Giacaloni, and Chucky followed suit, refusing to answer questions before a Detroit grand jury. The case took a twist when Ralph Picardo, an imprisoned mob insider, claimed to know what happened to Hoffa. According to Picardo, the killers were Sally Bugs, his brother Gabriel, and Thomas Andretta, a driver with a rap sheet to match. Picardo said Hoffa's body was transported in an oil drum to a New Jersey landfill. Picardo's information aligned with the FBI's suspicions, but none of the implicated men cooperated. Andretta did testify before the grand jury, but only after consulting his lawyer, William Bufalino, 1,117 times in the hallway, a process that dragged on for 6 weeks. Ultimately, Andretta offered nothing beyond a rehashed version of the Greek rummy alibi. Meanwhile, the search for Hoffa, or his remains, became almost farcical. Digging crews scoured garbage dumps, swamps, and construction sites, including one infamous excavation under Giants Stadium, but no trace of Hoffa was ever found. Suspicion circled Provenzano and Giacaloni, both ruthless mobsters with a history of making inconvenient people disappear. Provenzano's record was particularly colorful. In 1961, a rival union leader who dared run against him vanished without a trace. Years later, a mob associate who crossed him reportedly met his end via a tree shredder. Hoffa's own union dealings weren't without bloodstains. One attorney linked to a failed Teamster venture disappeared after allegedly misappropriating funds. Theories about Jimmy Hoffa's fate read like a deranged game of Mafia Clue, where every scenario is more grotesque than the last. One persistent story involved a New Jersey landfill owned by Philip Brother Moscato, a mob associate of Tony Provenzano. Brother's Dump, as it was charmingly known, was thought to be a preferred resting place for those who had crossed Tony Pro, including the likes of Anthony Castellito and Koki Fagno. The FBI sent 4 poor agents to sift through 47 acres of stinking methane-ridden garbage. Power shovels were deemed too risky due to the possibility of fire, leaving the agents to dig manually through heaps of rotting refuse. After a week of stomach-churning labor, they abandoned the search without uncovering anything more sinister than the landfill itself. Doubters dismissed the dump theory as absurd. Michigan mobsters were plenty adept at disappearing people on their home turf, so why cart Hoffa all the way to New Jersey? One theory closer to home posited that Hoffa's body was shredded and incinerated at Central Sanitation Services in Hamtramck, Michigan, a waste disposal business run by Detroit mobsters Rafael Quasarano and Pete Vitale. Both were aligned with Frank Fitzsimmons and Roland McMaster in the battle for control of Hoffa's former Teamster stronghold, Local 299. Central Sanitation came under scrutiny when it was revealed that Fitzsimmons had borrowed one of their cars just days before Hoffa's disappearance. FBI agents searched the facility, aided by scent-sniffing dogs, but found nothing. By then, too much time had likely passed to detect evidence, and the case hit yet another dead end. False leads became a hallmark of the Hoffa investigation. A tip about a body in a Michigan swamp turned up nothing but rattlesnake nests. CBS News wasted resources following a trail to the Florida coast, while another wild goose chase in Pennsylvania uncovered a mob victim, but not Hoffa. Former mob hitman Charles Grimaldi offered a macabre automotive theory, claiming Hoffa's body was crushed in a car compactor and melted down into steel. "Hoffa is now a goddamn hubcap," Grimaldi told his biographer, in a line as darkly poetic as it is horrifying. Chucky O'Brien reportedly echoed this, once telling witnesses Hoffa had been turned into just a fender. The most grotesque claim came from mob hitman Donald Tony the Greek Frankos. In 1989, from his perch as a protected federal witness, Frankos provided Playboy magazine with an account dripping in gruesome detail. According to him, Hoffa was killed because he wanted his union back and had threatened to expose mob operations to federal authorities. Frankos alleged that two Irish hitmen, John Sullivan and Jimmy Coonan, carried out the job alongside Sally Bugs Briguglio. Hoffa, lured by promises of a peace meeting with Tony Pro, was picked up at the Red Fox by Chucky O'Brien and driven to a safe house in Mount Clemens, Michigan. There, Coonan shot Hoffa twice in the head with a silenced .22 pistol. What followed was stomach-churning. Hoffa's body was dismembered in the basement using a buzzsaw and meat cleaver. Coonan reportedly kept a lock of Hoffa's hair as a macabre trophy. The pieces were bagged and stored in a freezer until a decision was made about disposal. Initially, Hoffa was destined for a car compactor, but disputes between Detroit and New York mob factions led to a different plan. 5 months later, the body parts were stuffed into an oil drum and transported to New Jersey, where they were buried under the Meadowlands football stadium near Section 107. Frankos claimed the story was relayed to him by Joe Sullivan, another mob killer, who allegedly took him to a Giants game to toast Hoffa's final resting place. While federal investigators found aspects of Frankos' account credible, they declined to dig up the stadium to confirm the tale. Theories about Hoffa's murder abound, but many point to Russell Bufalino, a mob boss with much to lose if Hoffa regained power. Bufalino's ties to Tony Pro, Detroit mobsters, and the Teamster pension fund made him a central figure in the drama. FBI surveillance even caught Bufalino dining with Tony Pro and Sally Bugs days after Hoffa's disappearance. Despite years of investigation, no hard evidence has surfaced. The lack of a body, reliable witnesses, or definitive forensic proof has kept the case mired in uncertainty. However, justice found some suspects in indirect ways. Many of Hoffa's enemies, including Fitzsimmons, Provenzano, and Giacalone, eventually faced legal or personal ruin. Yet Hoffa himself remains a ghost, his disappearance a testament to a life lived among dangerous men with dangerous secrets. The tangled web of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance continues to unravel long after his presumed death, and the players in his drama often found themselves tied to the same fate, albeit with varying levels of violence, prison sentences, and indignities. One particularly lurid detail surfaced a year after Ralph Picardo's claim about Hoffa's body in an oil drum. Another informant, in a separate prison, confessed to participating in the 1961 murder of Anthony Castellito, who had dared challenge Tony Provenzano for leadership of Local 560. The names in this tale sounded like a broken record. Provenzano, Salvatore Sally Bugs Briguglio, and Harold K.O. Konigsberg, a menacing debt collector who had once been a sparring partner of Joe Louis. Provenzano allegedly contracted Briguglio and Konigsberg to handle Castellito, and while the FBI couldn't act on the new evidence due to statute limitations on kidnapping, New York police took up the case. Provenzano was convicted of Castellito's murder in 1978 and sentenced to life. He died in prison. Briguglio, meanwhile, dodged the courtroom but not the mob's bullets. Standing outside a Little Italy restaurant in March 1978, he was gunned down by two hooded men. 5 shots to the head, 1 to the chest. It was a signature mob silencer. Investigators believed he was killed to ensure his silence about Hoffa and other crimes, a theory Donald Francos later corroborated, claiming one of the shooters was Joe Sullivan, the man who allegedly transported Hoffa's remains to the Meadowlands. The dominoes continue to fall. Tony Jack Giacalone was convicted of tax fraud, receiving a 10-year sentence. Chucky O'Brien served a year for extortion, then got caught filing a fraudulent loan application. The once cocky foster son of Hoffa spent part of a Teamsters convention hiding under a bed. Terrified Provenzano was looking for him. Meanwhile, Fat Tony Salerno, Jimmy Coonan, and Joe Sullivan were locked up for decades on unrelated charges, their sentences ranging from 75 to 100 years. Russell Bufalino also fell, convicted of extortion and given a comparatively light 4-year sentence. Still, the Hoffa case remains officially open, though most key players have long since shuffled off this mortal coil. The legacy of Hoffa's disappearance, along with whispers about his possible ties to the Kennedy assassination and CIA mafia operations, has cast a long, shadowy pall over organized labor and government alike. The Teamsters didn't exactly clean house after Hoffa. 2 of the 3 presidents following him faced indictments, with one convicted of embezzling over $700,000. In 1983, Hoffa ally-turned-adversary Alan Dorfman was assassinated in a Chicago parking lot before he could testify in one of his 3 pending cases. The FBI's release of taped conversations from Tony Giacalone's office added more layers of betrayal to Hoffa's story. Sylvia Pagano, Hoffa's former lover and Chucky's mother, had become Tony Jack's mistress and a spy against Hoffa. The tapes revealed a sordid plot involving Sylvia, Tony Jack, and his brother Vito to rob Hoffa's Washington apartment, believing he had hidden cash there. They even implicated Sylvia in coaxing Hoffa's wife, Josephine, into an affair with a mobster named Tony Semini, a humiliation Hoffa reportedly swallowed by appealing to Detroit's mob boss Joseph Zerilli to end it. The recordings painted a picture of a man betrayed at every turn, even by those he trusted most. They also deepened the mystery of why Hoffa was killed. The straightforward answer seems to be power. Hoffa's bid to regain the presidency of the Teamsters threatened powerful interests in both the mob and the union's leadership. Whether his pledge to clean up the union was genuine or a convenient rallying cry, it made him too dangerous to let live. If Hoffa's promise was sincere, his death robbed labor of a rare chance to break free from mafia control. In his final years, Hoffa appeared to undergo a transformation. At Lewisburg Prison, he became a voracious reader of history, sociology, and law. He confided to his son, Jim, that he wanted to take his place in labor history by kicking the mob out of the Teamsters once and for all. But in the world Hoffa had built and thrived in, redemption came too late. Betrayed by old friends, ensnared by a lifetime of deals with devils, and underestimated by those who saw him as a relic, Hoffa's final act was one of tragic irony. His vow to clean up the Union sealed his fate. James Riddle Hoffa, the man who had done more than anyone to entangle the Teamsters with the mob, may have finally taken a hard look at his choices and paid the ultimate price for them. Jimmy Hoffa's story doesn't end with answers, it ends with echoes. A lifetime of power plays, betrayals, and dangerous alliances left him surrounded by men who had everything to gain from his silence. His disappearance remains one of America's darkest and most enduring mysteries, a grim reminder that in the world Hoffa built, loyalty was a commodity, and even legends could be erased. Whatever the truth, Hoffa's shadow lingers, beneath the concrete, behind the closed doors of power, and in the history books that struggle to pin down the man who was larger than life, and yet, in the end, vanished completely.